Christopher Simmons was only 17 when he committed a terrible, brutal crime.
Christopher Simmons' crime was a particularly heinous murder.
On September 9th, 1993, Simmons and another teenager broke into a home in Fenton, Missouri. When the owner of the home, Shirley Crook, woke up, Simmons tied her up, drove her to a nearby bridge, and threw her into the river. Shirley Crook drowned.
It's hard to imagine something more horrific, something more terrifying or horrifying.
Simmons was arrested the next day.
He confessed to the crime, and he also engaged in a reenactment of the crime for the police, and both the confession and that reenactment were introduced into evidence at his trial.
Simmons was convicted and sentenced to death. But what happened next redefined how we treat juveniles in our criminal justice system. It also redefined what we as a nation consider cruel and unusual punishment.
He was sitting on death row in Missouri at the time that the Atkins decision came down. And he had a public defender at the time who read the Atkins decision and thought, this sounds a lot like the kinds of impairments and incapacities that children have as defendants, and thought that it was an appropriate time to, in a sense, resurrect a challenge to the death penalty for someone who was 17 years old.
The Atkins decision was based on the idea that 30 states had outlawed the execution of the intellectually disabled, and we now had 30 states that outlawed the execution of juvenile offenders.
On March 1st, 2005, the Supreme Court ruled in a 5-4 decision that executing juveniles violated the cruel and unusual punishment clause of the Eighth Amendment. The court reduced Simmons' sentence to life in prison, ruling that the death penalty is not a proportional punishment for juveniles, that adolescents are not as responsible as adults, so the penalty should not be the same, even if the crime is. Applying the evolving standards of decency test used in Atkins, the court ruled that the national opinion on the juvenile death penalty had changed. A new national standard had evolved.
The court looked around the country again, and what it saw was a shift in what the states were doing, and a shift that was all in one direction, a shift away from executing those who were younger than 18 when they committed their crimes.
Writing the majority's decision, Justice Anthony Kennedy ruled that the change in national opinion provides sufficient evidence that today, our society views juveniles, in the words Atkins used respecting the intellectually disabled, as categorically less culpable than the average criminal.
Justice Kennedy essentially wrote that children have an immaturity of judgment, they're impulsive, they're impetuous when they make decisions.
Justice Kennedy cited the recent scientific data on adolescent development, writing, "As any parent knows, and as the scientific and sociological studies confirm, a lack of maturity and an underdeveloped sense of responsibility are found in youth, more often than in adults."
He said that children had a particular susceptibility to peer pressure. He also recognized that children had a unique capacity for rehabilitation and to change.
The decision in Roper versus Simmons banned the execution of people under the age of 18 across the country. And in the years following Roper, the court has continued to recognize that children and adolescents have a capacity to change. It ruled that the Eighth Amendment prohibits sentences of life without parole for juveniles for non-homicide crimes. It prohibits mandatory life without parole sentences for all juveniles, regardless of the crime. And the court has even overturned the sentences of mandatory life without parole of thousands of older prisoners who were sentenced when they were juveniles, some going back decades. The juvenile justice system has begun to move back towards the rehabilitative model it began with over a century ago.
In 1899, it was really intuition that said, we know kids are different. Today, we have a scientific vocabulary that allows us, through the use of psychological research as well as neuroscience, to put words and names on those conditions and attributes of adolescence that justify creating a more benevolent and a more rehabilitative system.
It's not just anecdotal. It's what we know from scientific studies done by developmental psychologists, done by developmental neuroscientists, that say, not only do we think kids are different, we can prove that they're different.